Good evening, everybody, or afternoon, morning, wherever you might be. As Amanda noted, I work at AAAS and Science, which is based in Washington, D.C. I myself am located in Pennsylvania right now. And today I'm going to talk to you about what is happening at Science and the Science family journals in this time of COVID, when so much research is being published and pre-printed and promoted. And I'm also going to give you a small look at what our weekly analysis shows that Japanese reporters are covering in the way of scientific topic and content. So what I'll talk about today is what we are seeing at the Science family journals in terms of COVID submissions by authors, how many of those are being accepted, for example, and how many of those have preprint counterparts, which I think is really interesting to think about now, especially when it comes to promoting research to media. I will talk about how my team, the Science Press Package team, which is charged with communicating science to global press, is working to support contextualized and accurate communication of COVID research. This has all been a little bit more challenging because, as you may or may not know, all of this research has to be communicated immediate release with no embargo. We have to get it out a little bit faster, and reporters don't have the embargoed period to research it. I'll talk about what authors are saying about the visibility of the COVID research that they've done at the preprint stage as compared with what happens when they publish it with us and we promote it to press. We think this is an interesting dichotomy to explore. It certainly shows the value of a peer-reviewed journal press package in helping to obtain visibility for research. As I alluded to before, I'll talk about what reporters are saying about covering COVID research in this fast-moving landscape where they don't have an embargoed period to do their normal analysis and outreach. And then again, I'll give a little overview of the topics that reporters are covering at 5 top Japanese outlets, what we're seeing week to week. So I just want to remind people who may not be familiar with the philosophy of AAAS and Science with respect to communicating science, what it is. We believe that publishing in the journal doesn't end with accept. Rather, a paper being accepted starts a whole new process of science communication that I'm really proud to be a part of and I think is really important, and that we've heard a lot of good feedback from authors about. The way that we can do this work to take accepted papers, dozens of them, across 6 journals every week and communicate how they are different in their fields one to the next, often with visuals, is because we have an excellent team at AAAS. We serve 6,000 reporters and growing around the world. We are 5 science writers who look at new science papers and try to communicate even more clearly than the abstracts and the introduction of a paper, how a paper moves its field forward. We have communications associates that some of you might have worked with at your various institutions who give you advance notice that a researcher at your institution is publishing, so you can be part of the process with us, writing news releases, generating visuals. We do this work for 6 journals every week, and we generate 5 online press packages on Eureka Alert. What do those press packages look like? Here's a screenshot where you can see some of our press package on the left. What you see here is little bits of the lay summaries that we write for various papers. On the right, you can see an outcome that we love to have for any of the papers we're publishing, which is a very nice news story. In that case, this was published in The Guardian in the UK. We like to think of our press packages as helping 6,000 reporters around the world plan their story pipelines every week. So this is what we're producing. And we're really motivated to do it well, to write the lay summaries of research that we write clearly and accurately with context. In particular, because of the way we know the science news can affect so much, including policymaking. The former congressman at AAAS, the former CEO at AAAS Rush Holt had also been a congressman for 14 years in Washington, D.C., and he would tell us that when he was in Congress, his colleagues told him that they didn't read the new papers from Science, Nature, and Cell to understand the science. They read the science news stories about those papers. So we think it's even more important that the news stories do a good job of saying what the new research does and doesn't mean. Our philosophy is that we want reporters to cover the science right or not at all. And we really mean it. And what do I mean by right? My team diagnoses two problems in science communication, which you all may think about and agree with or want to add on to, but we are primarily concerned with hype, research being represented for more than it is, and we're also concerned about basic research, getting the boot, as I say, or not getting as much attention. And really, it's a very important part of trends forming in science and building onto bigger applied ideas later. So to navigate these issues, we use our summaries of new papers as powerful tools. We are careful to say no to hype in writing them, to not represent prototypes as near to application or commercial use, for example. We are big on providing context about the model in which research was done, or whether it was a randomized controlled trial, for example, in an epidemiological context, or another study design. And we include limitations wherever we can in our summaries of new research. And this has been very important for coronavirus in the research that we're communicating. And when we're designing our summaries to go into our press packages, we use several different tools and approaches to make them as compelling as possible for reporters, and based on what we understand they like to think about and cover. And again, also to make sure that context and limitations are represented. Some of the things that we do are, as represented in the first bullet here, we will reach out to authors to ask them to give us a one-line sentence explaining how their research moves the field forward. This seems like a really remedial thing, but it's often the case that that kind of information isn't communicated as clearly as it could be in the introduction for various reasons. And but we try to get around that by asking the authors for something clear we can include for press up front. We also, for basic research papers in particular, have a list that we call surprisingly newsworthy elements, things that we've talked to reporters about and they've said move the needle for them or inspire them to cover research. These are things that are apart from the actual finding. Maybe it's a new method having been used, or an old method which hadn't been used for 30 years having been used anew in a paper, or maybe the research was done in a very unusual geography or among an especially international cohort of scientists. We look for these elements in the papers we're promoting. We try to highlight them to press, and we encourage authors to pitch themselves, to pitch these angles, and that's something that's worked out very well. We ask authors to communicate personal stories about their trials and triumphs in their field. Reporters at the New York Times and many other outlets have told us they are motivated by personalities in science, so that's important. And you know, along the lines of what James was discussing, we ask for video of methods, place, experiments. We ask for infographics where studies represent more quantitative elements. And we do encourage the authors sometimes, if a study seems poised to really get a lot of pickup and is related to public health context, for example, but is still only in mice, we ask the authors to give us a little video that explains the limitations and talks about when the related health finding could be applied in humans. So these are things we've always done, and now we're doing them at this time. This is the first pandemic where science communication is happening in the way it is, and what I mean by that is where preprints are being used at such a scale. We didn't see that with Zika and Ebola. I'd been talking to the science editors about, you know, reasons why that was. Those were more geographically constrained pandemics, but it's also the case that with COVID, a lot of different fields, mathematics, physics, all feel like they can play a part. They're submitting preprints. There's tons of research out there. It's a minefield for journalists. And I think you saw this a few months into the pandemic. There were many news stories that I tracked. These are just a few examples that highlighted how journalists had to navigate preprints and figure out which COVID science to communicate. Of course, we are publishing a select amount of peer-reviewed COVID studies as well, and we're very keen for reporters to cover those studies. We think that they represent a very good sample of research that's likely to bear out and do something different in its field. And in terms of what we are seeing in the way of COVID submissions at Science and what we're publishing, I have a slide here that was updated as of September, and you can see that across the 6 science family journals, we have 6, Science Signaling being our smallest journal, although a journal where quite a few researchers from Japan publish. Across the 6, by the end of September, some 2,700 COVID papers had been submitted, and on average, 4% of those across the journals were accepted. You can also see something interesting here. About 33% of these had preprint counterparts, and that presents an interesting challenge for my office. Authors are often wondering if they can talk to reporters at the time of the preprint or if they should wait until the peer-reviewed version, and that is something that we help them think through, but we do direct them as much as possible to wait until the point of the peer-reviewed version to communicate to reporters, including so they have a copy they can distribute of the peer-reviewed research. And we make all of our COVID research and other public health research free. So a lot of people hearing that Science is receiving so many COVID submissions have asked us, what are your editors doing differently? I think they're just ordering a lot of takeout. They're not doing anything differently in the way of looking for statistical rigor, making efforts to remove claims that go beyond what the paper says, asking for more data to firm up conclusions, and so forth. The only thing they're doing differently is reflected in the top bullet in this slide. They're doing review more quickly, and that's why I think they must be ordering a lot of takeout, because I don't know how they have time to cook or take care of themselves. But we on our team are still focused on communicating all of this research. This research, again, is being published with no embargo, immediate release. Science, like many journals, is part of the Wellcome Trust Rapid Data Sharing Agreement, and so we're publishing COVID papers on that scale and cycle. So at my team, this looks like doing a lot of the same work I mentioned before. We're issuing our lay summaries to press of new COVID papers. We're really working hard to disentangle how each one is different than the next. This has been a challenge in some spaces, like the cryo-EM that's evaluating viral structure, for example, but I think it's been a fun challenge to understand how these papers are building on each other and different and contributing in new ways. We've also held teleconferences on these papers on the same day that they go out. That's what we have to do, but that has worked. The first of these we held had 70 reporters from just as many outlets show up. It was quite a success. We've had Facebook Lives on these papers, which are not geared for just reporters, but rather are geared for the public. They bring authors in. They can take questions from the general public, even after a paper has been published. That's been really successful for us too. We highlight new research on social media, and we also share our lay summaries with policymakers. We reach out to the White House head of office, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, to share our lay summaries. So they're not just going to reporters, but also to policymakers. And they have said that that is very helpful at the White House, and we hope that it is. Here, if you all are familiar with altmetrics, which looks at news coverage and social media pickup for a paper after it's been published, here is the altmetric score for a paper that we published in April. This one had a sobering punchline based on modeling from Mark Lipsitch, who's a known epidemiologist, and colleagues. It envisioned that social distancing could be needed until 2022. That was my caveat in the absence of therapeutics. Does look like we have some good therapeutics coming. But that paper, interestingly, had a preprint on medRxiv. And even so, when it came out, and this is representative of what we're seeing broadly, when it came out with us and when we promoted it, it obtained wide news coverage, which you can see here on the right-hand side. Some 500 outlets covered it. Twitter was very vocal about the paper. The authors were very happy with how that went. And here is some feedback from that author group about how visibility with the journal looked as compared to when the same paper, well, an earlier version of the paper had been on the preprint. They talk about visibility expanding massively with publication, and publication with us also ushering their research into mainstream conversation and policy making. So that is an outcome that we really like to help authors achieve through our press package outreach. So this landscape, again, the COVID research that we're publishing is all going out immediate release, no embargo. By contrast, the typical embargo at Science is about 4.5 days. We wanted to know what reporters who are having to cover or consider this COVID research are thinking about, doing this without the typical embargo period. Just to back up a step, every time a new reporter registers with us, we ask them, how do you find the value of the embargo in doing the work that you do? I have some numbers on the screen here from a survey of the last 540 reporters or so who've answered this question for us. And you can see that some 85% of them find the embargo very or moderately useful. A smaller percentage, about 4.5%, say it's not very useful. When we looked into that more, those reporters were typically covering things from more of a monthly publication, so the embargoed period, the urgency and immediacy is less a factor for them. It's not so much that the embargo is something they inherently dislike. But so you can see that reporters really value the embargo in many cases. So what is it like not having it for COVID? We talked to Helen Branswell, a reporter at STAT, Carl Zimmer at the New York Times, Lauren Neergaard, a longtime health reporter at the AP, and Dan Bergano, now at BuzzFeed News, and asked them, how are you finding this? And they all said that not having an embargo is challenging for them. They are not reaching as many sources to write each story, given the urgency of getting a story out, and they're not providing as much context. So, that's what we're dealing with, for better or for worse. Let's shift a moment to talk about our press package work in Japan. Japan, we have some 200 reporters from Japan who are registered with the Science Press Package and getting it every week. That means they're also getting our COVID immediate release new paper notifications. We work with a group called ASCA. We have for many years. They are terrific. They are based in Japan and help us monitor coverage from 5 Japanese news outlets online every week. They give us insights into which Science Family Journal papers are being covered in those 5 outlets and which competitor journal papers are getting covered in those 5 outlets. And for the months of August and September, you can see that based on the articles covered, reporters were interested in topics that include neurology and immunology, and there's also a lot of interest in archaeology and anthropology month to month. I would say I'm a little surprised that more of our coronavirus coverage hasn't been covered in Japan, and I'd love to hear from anyone on the line, perhaps later in Q&A, as to whether you may have any insights about that. So we are also interested in pitching to reporters in Japan in ways that are truly effective, but having talked to several PIOs from Japanese institutions in recent months, we've understood that we might need to develop some new ways to do that. Perhaps reaching editors at news desks at Japanese news outlets would be a better way to go. So I just wanted to note that also in Q&A, I'd be happy to hear from anyone who may have insights on how to do this. Right now, we are at least reaching our Japanese reporter registrants with our Sunday night press package, but perhaps there's more we can do in the way of follow-up pitching. That is definitely something we do to and for reporters in other parts of the world. So I wanted to end my presentation by highlighting a couple questions that perhaps are on your minds. And the first of these is, how can PIOs help accurate reporting of research published in Science in COVID times? I think this is a challenge for everybody right now. What I would say is that all the COVID papers that come to Science are rigorously, after they are accepted, they are rigorously evaluated across the writer group on my team. And we think about who's been writing about the epidemiological modeling or the viral structure work or the seroprevalence, and try to assign the paper summary to that person. So if you are publishing COVID research at Science from your institution and want to reach out to me and give information and insights about your view on the paper and its importance and its distinctions, I would make sure they get to that writer, so that writer can fold them into the summary that they're preparing. This all has to happen pretty fast, as you can imagine. Instead of the traditional 1 to 2 week notification to a PIO about a forthcoming COVID paper, sometimes you're looking at 72-hour advance notice. But as you hear from us, please feel free to reach out to me so we can work together on the best lay summary of this research. Of course, you're always welcome to contribute news releases or visual explainers, including with your authors if you have them, or if you have the capacity to make video. You could also identify to us what we call, again, and what I had mentioned before, surprisingly newsworthy elements in your paper, distinctions that you understand to be real, whether that's a method that was used or a cell line that was used or something non-conventional that your research group decided to pursue. Hearing about those distinctions can also really help us write a summary that's not only accurate, but most likely to resonate with reporters who are looking for those distinctions as well. My second bullet here, what should PIOs be mindful about with respect to preprints? So we are talking to PIOs in the United States in particular and trying to do it elsewhere. And we are hearing from those that we've talked to, at least, that they are getting a lot of interest from the investigators at their institution to promote preprints on COVID, but they are often serving as gatekeepers and talking to those researchers and using that moment to inform them about why promotion at the point of preprint may not be the best choice. So that's the consensus that we've heard from many PIOs that we've talked to. There are a few select cases where they will promote a preprint with a press release, but there aren't many. And I think a really interesting question in this space is what fraction of preprints are not being published in journals at all? And as far as we can understand, it's a pretty large fraction, and that will probably continue to be so. Last bullet here, has Science seen a difference in the submissions to our journals from Japan as compared to other countries? So I checked with our editorial team before this presentation to get some insight into this. Submissions from Japan have always been very strong. The percentage, the ref percentage in the last few years has not changed, although the sheer volume of submissions from Japan has gone up just as it has in many other places. And it includes much good COVID research as well. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. I would also be happy to hear your thoughts on how best to reach reporters in Japan, etc.